Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of Antioch on the Meander, also known as the Battle of al-Athir, if I pronounce it correctly. That was a military engagement near Antioch on the Meander between the forces of the Empire of Nicaea and the Seljuk Sultanate of Rome. It resulted in a Turkish defeat that ensured the continuation of Nicaean hegemony of the Aegean and of the coast of Asia Minor. And it's also famous because in this battle, the Seljuk Sultan Kushro I was killed on the field. And the battle took place near the modern town of Yamalak in Kuyu district of the Haydn province. It's in Turkey today. And what we're going to do today is to give a bit of background, of introduction, and then to read two of the Byzantine sources of the battle. As far as I know, there are just, I think, at least among the significant ones, Byzantine sources and the Turkish ones. I wasn't able to find the Turkish ones, but I've read some study that talks about them. And as far as I understood, the most significant information about the battle is contained in the Byzantine sources, and especially in these two chronicles of Gregoras and Acropolis that we're going to read directly from the text. So that help us just make also a bit of a to show how method could work and what we can be told about this. Looking at the background, so we are after the capture of Constantinople by the forces of the Fourth Crusade of 1204. So this had resulted into the partition of the Byzantine Empire. And Theodore Lascaris, reigning between 1205 and 1222, was crowned Roman Emperor in 1208, building a power base in the former Byzantine territory of Western Anatolia. Right. So this is this new polity was to become known as the Empire of Nicaea, from which eventually the Paleologi would be able to reconquer Constantinople at the end of the 13th century. And there were other main Greek successor states that claimed the heritage of what had been the empire. You can find also Epirus in Western Greece, etc. But let's say that Nicaea was the most important one of them, and it's interesting because of its location, because it was threatened from the north by the Latin Empire that was had been established by the Crusaders, and from the east by this secular enemy of the empire since previous times, the Seljuk Sultanate of Rome, right? That was established after the loss of the Anatolian plateau after the battle on Manzikert, and was in fact what Rome means is Rome, right? So that the Seljuks that settled in there were recognizing that those were fundamentally had been Roman lands that had come to possess, right? So looking a bit about the characters, the main characters, at least Theodore Lascaris, that is basically Theodore the First Palaiologos, and Kai Kushro the First. So Theodore had married Anna, that had been the daughter of Alexis III Angelus. This had happened in 1199, so before actually the end of the let's say before the conquest of Constantinople. This is important because Alexis III Angelus, that we will describe also later, participated, at least it was at the battle of Antioch of the Meander, and was captured in there. So this was very important. Now we'll see what relations we want here, because essentially Theodore was the son-in-law of Alexis, and during this time, those previous times, Theodore had been promoted to the rank of despotes. Right, it was a title of quite an importance. It was maintained even, for example, in the despotate of Epirus. So it's this greater figures, greater powers. Not, I don't think it was necessarily institutionalized at that point as a figure, but it came to define these powerful lords, right? And after his father-in-law's overthrow in July 1203, Theodore escaped with his wife to Asia Minor, right? And that's there where he began to lay the foundations of this empire in exile, right? Centered on Nicaea, was the most important center in Byzantine Asia Minor, and organizing the resistance to the Latins and bringing local rulers under his control. Now, this is a very fascinating background, by the way, because the fall, we can say, of the Byzantine Empire in 1204 had brought to this dispersion not just of the Byzantine elements that, as we have seen, but had brought to a further westernization of Byzantine military culture, specifically, not just a political military culture as well. At this point, the Nicene Empire would build its strength settling, for example, other Westerners that were basically all over the Mediterranean at this point, coming from Western Europe, essentially, as mercenaries. We made on Schwerpunkt a video on the Byzantines and and of the Franks in the Seljuk armies. If you're interested, it's in the Medieval Warfare Byzantine playlist. So there is this broader idea of a progressive westernization, also Byzantine military culture, that is exemplified by the settlement of actual Western knights as feudatories of the empire in this Nicaean lands, right? And this is important because we will see that in the Battle of Antioch, this properly Western Frankish or Latin element would play a very important part in the fight. And so in 1205, an assembly at Nicaea had proclaimed Theodore emperor, and in the aftermath, actually, of the Latin defeat at the Battle of Adrianople in 1205, and therefore Theodore's elevation to the office was confirmed by his coronation in March of 1208 by the new Patriarch Michael IV Autoreianos, if I read correctly, yes. So it's in this context basically that, as we will see, the Theodore had to meet this full scale Seljuk invasion against led by Seljuk Sultan K. Kushro the First, also known as Giyat al-Din, actually. It was the Seljuk Sultan of Iconium. It was the principal city in Muslim Anatolia at this point. You know that basically the Sultanate of Iconium was this, or Sultanate of Rome, was this larger element hegemonizing largely Turkish Anatolia and all these emirates that had been formed and that sometimes had been used, even would keep being kept to be used by the Byzantines to to attack the same Seljuks in some ways. So here the affiliations are very very floating, given religion is not really the discriminant at the end of the day. It's an extremely complicated picture. But this was the main power that could, at that point, especially after the fall of Constantinople, now hegemonize the whole Anatolia, and even trying to absorb the Nicene Empire. Think about it. For the Seljuks, the situation after 1204 was unique because for the first time their sultanate was not facing the empire anymore, a unique empire anymore. The empire had always been the strongest power there. Now the situation is kind of reversed, or at least the reason maybe they are meeting on equal ground against Nicaea, but not much, because actually at this point the sultanate, I think it was more powerful. So the Turks were basically facing all these other Greek states in Asia Minor instead of a single centralized empire. It was a big deal. We have seen on Schwerpunkt on many occasions how the sudden fragmentation of empire naturally brings from the other side if it was keeping pressure to take over, right? So it was a very critical moment, right? Think about the Nicaeans. From one side, the Latins; from the other side, the Seljuks, and they had their own allies, but still that game was extremely complicated and the risks to be wiped out very, very high. And initially, the Sultan had being constrained by his family ties, could not fully exploit the situation. What really set eventually Theodore and Kai Kushro against each other was the imprisonment at Theodore's hands of Mauro Zomes. Who was he? So Manuel Mauro Zomes was fundamentally a Byzantine nobleman who, in the aftermath of the Fourth Crusade, had tried to found an independent principality in Phrygia, so in this area of also northwestern, what would be today's northwestern Turkey. And his own daughter was married to the Seljuk Sultan Kai Kushro I, and he eventually became governor, emir of part of the region under Seljuk control, and he was this very influential figure in the Seljuk court until his death. This is interesting because objectively at this point, also in future events, sometimes there were alliances between this Greek Byzantine elements and with the Muslim lords. This is a very eloquent example that naturally has to take into consideration the broader ambition of this Greek states to recompose the Byzantine Empire as they had lost it. Naturally, another element that had not set very great expectation from the Byzantine side was the same Theodore's imperial coronation in 1208 that was naturally aiming at claiming back that hegemonic character that the Byzantine Empire had largely on the Anatolian plateau. And finally, the appearance of Alexis III Angelus in the Sultanate of Rome around 1210, as we will see. So that's basically the series of reasons that would bring in 1211 the Sultan to declare open war. And the Kai Khosrow I was the youngest son of Kilik Arslan II. Kai Khosrow received Acropolis in 1188, then briefly held Iconium itself. In 1196 he had ravaged the Meander Valley, and against the Byzantines had carried off about 5,000 captives. So there had been the precedents in the same area where eventually the Battle of 1211 would take place. And it was eventually driven from Iconium, and had sought refuge at the court of Alexis III. So there were these strict relations. He even, as we've seen, had married a daughter to Manuel Mauro Zomes and resided with him for some time. What is interesting from this side is that Acropolis states, this chronicler says that Kai Khosrow had even been baptized, and we don't have to be impressed particularly by this, because this, religious formalizations were just, things of political allegiance, right? At this point, the interest of Kai Khosrow was markedly pro-Byzantine at the beginning, and therefore, why not getting baptized? It happened after all. Byzantine and Seljuk had intermarried over time, so it's interesting also to see how the barrier of religion is much more ideal than anything. So eventually Kai Khosrow regains his throne, creating a principality on the Meander for Mauro Zomes. So you see this area, how important it is. That the valley of the Meander is basically what this major valley, very, very long, that goes in this axis basically west to east into the Anatolian hinterland. It has it had a very important significance for the Byzantines. It was a fertile area. It had this connection with the Aegean Sea. So it was an area that had seen centuries at this point of frontier warfare between the Byzantines from the coastal side and the Turks on the plateau. Right. When you look at these maps, always look at geography, especially for times like this, because that does influence. It's not everything, but you realize that basically the Turks maintain this interland, right? This plateau, also with a kind of a pastoral economy, lifestyle, etc. Well, the Byzantines retained most of the flat land and coastal areas, and this more urban and maritime trade-oriented dimension. So these are interesting geographical dimensions to follow. So and Kushro had initially even backed the same Theodore to consolidate his rule. So this is normal. The politics at this point is right back and forth, helping, and then going against on the base of the whole surrounding situation that is changing constantly, right? So eventually, Kushro had pressed towards the Mediterranean, taking Attaleia in March 1207. So it's important that he had managed to expand this formerly held Byzantine city. And around 1209, he had allied himself with Henry of Hainaut, so strengthening the relations now in anti-Nicene function with together with the Latins, right? So there's this event that we already mentioned that around 1210 he was joined by the refugee Alexis III that had and used the latter actually to claim the same Nicene throne, right? So you see here that he was formally recognizing the right of a Byzantine to rule on that Byzantine-held territory. And why? Because at that point, the Byzantine was in his hands, and it was a kind of a formal mean to impose this character. The previous emperor, actually, Alexis III, had been previous emperor of the empire, to control those areas, right, and absorbing the Nicene power itself. So, looking briefly at Alexis III, Angelus, born we think around 1153 and died basically the same 1211. He had been Byzantine emperor from March 1195 to July the 17th, 18th, 1203. He was a member of the extended imperial family, and Alexius came to the throne after deposing, blinding, and imprisoning his younger brother Isaac II, Angelus. And the most significant event of his reign was the attack of the Fourth Crusade on Constantinople in 1203, and the fall, obviously, that would occur later. And he did this on behalf of Alexis IV Angelus. So Alexis III took over the defense of the city during the Fourth Crusade, which he mismanaged, then fled the city at night with one of his three daughters. Right, this event is very famous. Read Nicetas Coniates about the story. It's very this is the collapse, right, of Constantinople, and from Adrianople he had fled to Thrace, to Adrianople, which was fairly close to Constantinople, but it's an important military center at this point, and eventually to Mosinopolis, unsuccessfully attempting to rally supporters, only to end up captive of Marquis Boniface of Montferrat. So eventually he was ransomed and sent to Asia Minor, where he joined, in fact, as we have seen, the Sultan of Rome, where and plotting against his son-in-law Theodore Lascaris. And as we will see, he would be captured in battle and eventually confined to the monastery of Zakynthos in Nicaea, where he died. So these are a bit the core characters involved in here. So let's pass to the battle. And this battle is interesting because, it's been considered to have been the third most important battle between the Byzantines and the Turks after Manzikert in 1071 and Myriosephalon in 1176, right? It was previously believed to have been fought in 1210, but, at this point modern research has conclusively established that it actually took place in the spring or early summer of 1211. And there were this, I accounts of the basic Muslim chroniclers of the 13th century Anatolia, that is Ibn al-Athir and Ibn Bibi, who consider al-Athir, also known as Philadelphia in Greek at the point, the battle's location. However, as we were saying before, the most detailed sources on the battle are the 13th and 14th century historiographer's work of George Acropolis, and that was the official court chronicle of the Nicene Empire, the Lascaris, so it was kind of the official version from the Byzantine side, and the polymath Nicephorus Gregoras. These had lived respectively between 1217 1282 and 1290 1359, so obviously the first one is kind of more reliable, even though the battle had taken place 6 years before he was born. Obviously, when you read these sources, always bear in mind what it meant to write about history, what was the point, the models, etc. So it's never cent reliable, but it's still kind of the best we have most of the times. It seems Muslim historiography at that point, especially one from Iconium, that was the closest historiographical center of production, we can say, that was evidently directly involved in this military affairs. It's kind of more basic, right? Islamic historiography at that point was kind of even more, let's say, stilized. I don't know how to say that, and generally gives less, kind of more stereotypical information and less actual new or more critical or insightful elements to reason. So basically, as we were saying before, we will be reading the passages of these two chroniclers about the Battle of Antioch on the Meander, and there are other sources. For example, the one of the bishop chronicler of Seljuks, Theodore Skoutariotis, who died in 1284, that however follows closely the Acropolis, right? So there is also the other one by the monk chronicler Ephem, who died after 1313, by the 14th century Vita Ioannis Batadze, that was composed by the Greek bishop of Pelagonia in Macedonia, George, as well as by an anonymous Byzantine short chronicle. And there are also some indirect references to the battle by the scholarly Koniate brothers, Michael and Niketas, who rejoice at the Christian victory in this rather long and bombastic panegyrics elogizing the victorious Nicene ruler Theodore. So yes, but essentially the core sources are the first one by Acropolis and Gregoras. Now that we will read. Both sources claim that the cause of the war was effectively the arrival of Alexis III Angelus in the lands of the Sultanate and his attempt to regain his throne with Seljuk assistance. And here we start reading. Let's read them one at a time. Then let's make our considerations about them. So this is the text of Georgius Acropolis, which runs as follows. So the Emperor Alexis III finally went to him, the Sultan Kushro in Konya, as he was not willing to take refuge with his son-in-law, the Emperor Theodore Lascaris in Nicaea. Taking with him the necessary provisions for the journey, he landed in Antalya, where was cordially received by the Sultan. Then the Emperor Theodore, who was ruling in Nicaea, received a legation sent by the Sultan, who informed him of the arrival of his father-in-law in Konya, the Emperor Alexis III, and accused him of having usurped the legitimate right of Alexius on the Byzantine throne. Theodore was alarmed at these words, and fear enveloped him because he knew that the Sultan was going to exploit Alexius' claims as a pretext for his real plans, that is, to conquer and to subjugate the entire Roman state, that is, the Byzantine Nicene Empire. So it was said things were balancing on a razor's edge for Theodore. He quickly summoned his confidants around him and asked them whether they would be on his side or they would support his father-in-law, the Emperor Alexis III. Upon this they all unanimously assured him that they were ready to fight and die for him. Thus, greatly encouraged by their noble words, Theodore left Nicaea, taking the Sultan's ambassador with him. After a rapid march, he arrived at Philadelphia, al-Athir, while the Sultan had reached the city on Antioch, which is situated on the river Meander. In Turkish would be today Büyük Menderes. He, Kushro, had brought the Emperor Alexis with him, his bait towards his plans of conquests, and was about to launch an attack on the city, Antioch, aiming at its capture. For that reason he had catapults erected, with which his forces began to bombard the walls. The city was on the verge of surrender when the Emperor Theodore arrived hastily there, fearing that if the Sultan had succeeded in capturing it, nothing would have been able to stand in his own way for the conquest of the entire Roman territory. He, Theodore, had decided to fight against the Sultan with the help and blessing of our Lord Jesus Christ, whose holy name has always been our shield and banner in war. So Theodore had ordered his soldiers to leave back their tents and heavy possessions which could carry the march of his army, had told them to carry with them only the absolute necessaries, that is, some food and their clothing, as well as everything that is useful for fighting, i.e. their armor, shields, and weapons. Theodore's army consisted of 2,000 men, 800 of which were Italian mercenaries, who were valiant and very capable warriors, as time would soon prove. The rest were 1,200 Romans. As soon as Theodore arrived at Antioch, he sent the Persian, that is the Seljuk ambassador, back to his master. To him, the ambassador said that the emperor had arrived and was preparing to attack him. The Sultan refused to believe that, but then the ambassador took an oath that it was true, so the Sultan summoned his troops and placed them in battle formations. They were attacked by the Italians at the beginning, but the massive bulk of the Muslim army annihilated them to their very last. The Italians had manifested a unique courage and glorious valor, having slain by their swords enemies many times their own number. The extermination of the Italians facilitated the Muslim advance against the Romans, whose majority began to withdraw and retreat at headlong speed, although a small number of them continued the fighting, waiting for the final outcome. And so it seemed that the Sultan had won the contest. He was restlessly trying to locate the Emperor Theodore when somebody of his soldiers pointed at him. The Emperor, still fighting, had found himself in a desperate position, and Kushro swiftly rushed upon him, encouraged by his own physical superiority. They immediately recognized each other. The Sultan hit with his mace, and the Emperor, dozed by the blow he had received on his head. Helmet fell from his horse. It is said that his horse fell with him, although I am not positive as to whether the Sultan hit it for a second time. But it was then that the unhorsed Emperor was suddenly revived by some divine power, and standing on his feet he unsheathed his sword. And as the Sultan had turned for a moment to his soldiers, crying boastfully, arrest him, the Emperor struck blow on the hind legs of the Sultan's mare, indeed colossal in size. The Sultan fell as if from a tower, and all of a sudden his head was chopped off, although neither the emperor nor his attendants knew who had decapitated him. Thus the emperor, a loser until that time, finally carried the day, although he could not advance and chase the enemy, since he had been left with very few soldiers. That is why the Romans, proposed a truce. The Muslims accepted and conducted a long-term peace with them. So, beautiful text, and it's the most detailed one. And after we read the one from Gregorius, right, that is kind of shorter, or maybe not, but let's first of all develop the first version, and then let's eventually read Gregorius and let's say develop the two things together to kind of compare them a little bit. So what is interesting about this source is that he makes a very logical sequence, right? It's very clear, it's military plausible, and it tells a lot of interesting things. So we have seen essentially this first, diplomatical problems that had occurred with the come of Alexis III, etc. So basically, at this point, the Turks invade the Meander Valley, and they besiege this city of Antioch, right? So for that time standards, it was normal. You went really. These were powers with fairly limited resources, so that warfare was waged normally, like large part of the Middle Ages, just taking castle by castle, city by city, right? So these were not immense centers, as you understand, but still were important because you could secure a lot. Just who have seen that, taking one, it's like basically adding all layers of new territory that can secure the internal ones, so that basically you shift the frontier outwards, right? And it's interesting because it says that the Seljuks had, erected this catapults with which they had started bombarding the city walls, and that the city, in fact, was about to surrender fundamentally. And Theodore, therefore, arrives there hastily, right? And this is important because the author says that if the city had fallen at that point, basically Theodore would have not had many probabilities of arresting at that point the rest of the Seljuk advance, right? And that he would have lost the entire Nicaean territory. So this kind of makes a lot of sense. You always remember that in medieval warfare, all the greatest battles have been fought around in order to relieve a siege, right? Check it. That's the basically the main strategic mover, right? You feel confident enough to invade enemy territory and to lay a city under siege, and at that point you wait the enemy to wait. He has two options: either he tries to relieve your siege, or he stays there and he loses the center, right? So at this point, we see that as we have noticed that we'll see, especially after better, that the Seljuks have this major upper hand, right? They're confident enough to invade the enemy territory, to put a settlement under siege, and Theodore is making sort of desperate moves because probably he had much less, like all the other sources basically hint at, forces than the Turks. But that was, if Antioch fell, at least for what we're concerned with this source, the whole Nicaean Empire would have been could have been easily conquered by the Turks at that point. So here there's this invocation and for the blessing of Christ, of course, as this is typical in all Christian sources at the time, and especially in the Byzantine ones that had this much more stilized reference to all this sound tradition, and their identity as a fully Christian empire. And the and what is interesting is that Theodore orders his soldiers to leave back all their tents and heavy possessions that could tarry the march of his army. And he tells them to bring just the absolute necessaries, like food, clothing, and everything like armor, shields, and weapons, etc. This is, of course, interesting because it tells you that if they're always giving, of course, that this was the case, that assuming that the source is telling the truth, is that this was no kind of movement situation. We've seen that the city was about to fall, so there was no time to waste. It was going there in order to attack. Waiting more would have made the city fall, would have consumed more resources. So if you really are going to make an effort, it's because either you attack the Turks or you simply remain in Nicaea, right? So this is important because when it's either win or die, you don't really care, in fact, even about having this close logistical center to you. You bring together only the necessary to fight, which makes you also lighter, makes you speedier, makes you consume less energies at the end of the day. So in a drastic offensive direction. So coming on the composition of the army, which is very interesting, the author says that Theodore's men were only 2,000. So some have suggested maybe the number was a bit higher, but here with the numbers of medieval sources is like all the times, we talk about men, but what men are we talking about? Are we talking about fighting force? Are we talking about all the people who were surrounding the army, like field aides, logists, like other civilians, merchants, prostitutes, etc.? So because this was the norm at this point. And here the source in fact doesn't give the numbers of the Seljuks, but as we will see, says that the Muslims were very many. But what is interesting about this, the composition of the Byzantine army, is that of these 2,000 fighters, 800 of them were Italian mercenaries. So this is very interesting because it's here I have in translation, but I think it's really Italian because it's repeated, and this would be normal at the time. The Byzantine, the empire had been conquered essentially by a Venetian French force, so it was full of Italians around in terms of, especially of ships, crews, mercenaries of various kinds, especially crossbowmen. But as we will see also from the other source, here we're talking about 800 actual knights, right? Cavalry, heavy cavalry, which is also used in a pretty damn offensive way. And the source praises the quality of these troops. It says these Italian mercenaries were valiant and very capable warriors, as time would soon prove, as it would happen in fact in the battle. And the rest, of course, mathematically, 1,200 were Roman troops, that is, Byzantine soldiers. So Theodore arrives at Antioch, and the two armies start negotiating, right? And Theodore sends back the Persian, aka Seljuk, ambassador back to his master. Here it's interesting that the term Persian is used, and it's probably not just because there was some equivocation about the let's say the ethnical background. Of course, the Seljuks were heavily Persified Turks, but at this point, yeah, they also have strong contacts with Persia, as they were part of the broader empire, by detached from the Iranian base at this point. But it's also possibly a kind of a classical echo as the Persians, like here talking about the Greeks and the Romans fighting like the ancient Persian masters of Asia, etc. Which makes it always remember that the Byzantines were masters in this literary references to the classical past, so it's possible. Makes it more resounding as a name. And he sent to the Sultan this message saying that he was about to attack him, right? This is interesting because it tells you, whether it's true or not, but it tells you this psychological attitude of saying, here I arrive and I attack you. I don't even ask you for a fight. I'm going to come there and smash you. And if you don't do it, and this is interesting because as far as we know, instead the Byzantines were in substantial disadvantage, numerically speaking. So this is a courageous idea, but it's still, as we've seen, if you have to attack at that point, you have no options. The better is also psychologically to show that you're ready for doing that and you're not giving any other option. And this is important because the Byzantine emperors, as long as the Constantinople had ruled over the rest of its territories, had dealt with the Seljuks as sort of, definitely not as peers, but sort of subjects, or at least someone they could legitimately look from the above. Now the situation had been reversed, right? So it's even more meaningful for this Nicene historiography to stress that things had not changed, that Theodore was the emperor of the Romans and he was going there to defeat a rebel, fundamentally, someone who had dared to attack Roman territory that therefore had to be wiped out. And this is interesting because the source even says the Sultan refused to believe that. And this could entail, well, obviously it's just a source, we don't really know whether it was the truth, but it's interesting because it could be a bit, have a double meaning that, not that maybe he feared him, but he couldn't believe, in fact, that such a smaller force like the Byzantine one could attack his army. But don't underestimate, in this sense, the condition that this entailed. Probably the Turks now had surrounded the city. They therefore had stretched all around, and they had necessarily to come to battle with the Byzantines, because those were maybe not so many, but they were definitely enough to render the Turkish defense vulnerable if they had not met them in open field, but just when they were deployed around the city in this pitched confrontational condition, pitched battle confrontational condition. So the Sultan questions the ambassador, which takes a note stating that what the Byzantine ruler had said was true, and the source says that in fact the Sultan summons his troops and places them in battle formations. So here we are. Okay, the two sides agreed. This was normal medieval warfare. This is an open confrontation. We've seen it was an important battle, right? This is probably the most important battle between the Byzantines and the Turks after Manzikert and Myriocephalum. So it really can make a difference, as we often say in Schwerpunkt. Here it's the beginning of the 13th century. These are not massive numbers, but still for these two powers, it's a lot of men altogether. So winning this battle definitely has a great importance, and as we will see, the outcome will basically freeze the border between the Byzantines and the Seljuks for something like almost half of a century, right? So losing so many men and so many resources in one battle really is something that has an impact through generations, because gaining resources in here, especially when you're attacked constantly from all sides, it's something really difficult and you want to save them. But this reinforces, in this sense, the importance of the battle and reinforces the credibility of Theodore's confidence and necessity of going there for some reason. And we tend to believe that the Byzantines might have been effectively more numerous than what these sources are actually claim. That also, of course, the Seljuks were not as many as other sources claim. For example, George of Pelagonia in the Vita Ioannis Batazze writes that the Byzantines were 3,000, as we will see before. Gregorius states that there were 2,000 as the Acropolites. And about these the Seljuk forces, and here I don't follow the source because I'm just making a complex reasoning, but I'm quoting you which other sources we're talking about. As we will see, Gregorius states that the Seljuks were 20,000. There are other sources that even claim, for example, George of Pelagonia actually states 60,000 men. Even the same Seljuk sources come to say things like 100,000. So obviously, there was nothing at the time that could be realistically fielded more than 50,000 men, right? And especially in this context, it was impossible because simply they didn't have the resources, not even for fielding actually 20,000. But it's the relation between these numbers that is important anyway, it's kind of fitting with what plausible with what we know about medieval warfare at this time. Like the Byzantines in this sense are kind of more westernized in warfare. It was more based on kind of heavily armored troops on a kind of also more infantry-based level. So there is this, less troops but kind of heavier, more costly. From the Seljuk side, you have probably some heavier cavalry, as we will see, that makes up a qualitative as well as a numerical elite. And then traditionally, these swarms of horse archers, right? There are typical of all Byzantine Turkish warfare along this Anatolian frontier, and that also on many other engagements could really be in this kind of kind of numerical ratios. Like the Romans kind of less but a bit heavier, so a bit more quality. The Seljuks a bit more but a bit lighter and therefore relatively less quality. About this battle, as we will see, we don't know very much, but there is this general pattern of interpretation that works given the numbers that the sources state. So, coming to the battle according to Acropolis, it says that the Turks were attacked by the Italians at the beginning. So the Byzantines start the battle, right? They are the ones who came there to fight, and therefore, the Seljuks do not have reason to give battle. I mean, yeah, they are deployed now. They are there in order to fight, but they don't need to. They want to maintain the advantage of defense because objectively they're not the ones who would ask first for that fight. Well, the Byzantines have, because the more time passes and the city can fall, and they consume also the meager resources that they have. So the Byzantines sent the Italians in first. And this, especially, it will be clearer when Gregorius talks about this. It's the Italians were a shock force. And in fact, they would do more than what Acropolis says, which is that the Italians were good warriors, right? He had emphasized the quality of these troops even over the Romans. About the Byzantines, it doesn't say these were great warriors. No, it says no. There was these 800 Latins who fought their own. They were great, etc. And this reinforces the fact in the narration that says, but the massive bulk of the Muslim army annihilated them to the very last. This is important, and the contrast is reinforced because it says that the Italians had manifested a unique courage and glorious valor, having slain by their swords enemies many times their own number. Right? This is important because it reinforces the idea that these were heavily armored knights. Right? At this point, you don't have light troops that this infantry with this. We're in the 13th century. This massive attacking capability. Infantries didn't attack at this time fundamentally. They were mostly a defensive element. In the history of the Western art of warfare, was still heavy cavalry did most of the job. Right? They could resist very well in defense, but in attack. So these are surely knights, at least cavalry, and they seem to be knights legitimately because it says that they killed many times their own number. So they get annihilated, but they they massacre, they take a lot of more not enemies with them to the grave. And this suggests naturally that reinforces the idea that the Seljuk army was stronger in numbers, and therefore, even though this was kind of the elite of professionals of war, because these were mercenaries, of heavily armored cavalry, etc., but the Muslims had enough numbers to absorb this charge and to annihilate them. After all, we know in the history of warfare, also later in the Ottoman, in the Balkans against the Crusaders, etc., we know that it was typical for this Eastern populations to fight, basically usually refusing the vanguard and attracting the enemy towards the center, and then enclosing on the flanks with their horse archers, and that's how they were massacred. Here it's not specified, and eventually there had been a fight, right? In Gregorius we will see that actually the author talks about Seljuk infantry as well. So it's possible that these heavily armored knights butchered down part of the Seljuk infantry before being eventually absorbed and annihilated. But the fact that here says that the Italians were annihilated to the very last suggests that there was probably more, like more of an enveloping maneuver, because normally, when someone routs, even when someone is defeated, the formation breaks, they can't run away, right? Here, it's not even that it says that these troops were pursued, but it says that they were massacred to the very last. So either they remained all, in the center of the Seljuk formation to be butchered down, but more realistically, that happens usually only with a lesser force of troops. The others, the majority tends to flee, but it's possible that these guys really had a high quality and that they were butchered down fighting to the very end, right? This is interesting. And the source goes on, says, this termination of the Italians facilitated the Muslim advance against the Romans, whose majority began to withdraw and retreat headlong speed. This is interesting because it suggests that probably this 800 Italian cavalry was kind of the heavier bulk of the army, right? Surely Theodore had his own bodyguard and kind of heavier units for the Byzantine side, but it's nevertheless very meaningful that it says the majority of the 1,200 Byzantines that had remained evidently back waiting for, because had fled, right? So the majority of them, it's like more than 600 at least. Excuse me, this is eloquent regarding the fact that, this was typical in this warfare of the time. It's saying that your cavalry had failed, especially if your troops were infantry, they would give way, because there was no way for infantry at that point, at the beginning of the 13th century. That is the apex of cavalry warfare in Europe. They could resist for long. Naturally, probably the Byzantines had other cavalry among the 1,200, but we don't know how many. And in fact, it says that a small number of the Byzantines continued to fight, waiting for the final outcome. This is now, think about the mechanics of the battle here, and it's normal that the two formations had several ranks, right? So it basically it's plausible to think that the Byzantine army had this first rank of the Italian knights in the front, Byzantine troops in the second line, which is normal, right? Usually battles at this time, they don't have more than 2 or 3 lines. So also keeping things simple is an advantage most of the times. So yeah, the Byzantines were counting on the shock effect of this heavily armored mercenary cavalry charging into the relatively softer Seljuk troops. Instead, those guys get annihilated, so now they're in serious trouble, because they're alone against the Muslims, and if the Byzantine formation gives way entirely, the battle is lost and probably all the whole empire of Nicaea. So the resistance of this small number of Byzantines is very meaningful, because it's typical of all battles that while someone flees en masse, there's always a unit that remains, stands the ground to fight to the death most of the times. It's very plausible that this was actually Theodore's bodyguard, as we've said before, so the elite. And now instead takes place this kind of topic event in the battle that changes the odds. And because it says, and so it seemed that the Sultan had won the contest, so it's even explicit at this point, right? The main part of the Byzantine army is destroyed. These other Byzantine troops are fleeing. There's just probably Theodore there with his faithful resisting. It's done, right? Especially considering that the Turks were probably, as it was normal, very, well served by light cavalry that could encircle very easily and making these flanking maneuvers. The resistance of the enemy would have soon crumbled. But it happens this thing that complicates relatively the narrative. It says that the Sultan was restlessly trying to locate Theodore, the emperor, when somebody of his soldiers, so of the Turkish soldiers, pointed at him. The emperor, still fighting, so here's Theodore, had found himself in a desperate position, and Kushro swiftly rushed upon him, encouraged by his own physical superiority. So it's interesting because at this point you see that the Theodore is in a desperate situation. So the whole thing is collapsing. Probably the Turks have really won the day, but there is this kind of almost individualistic ethos that is typical of chivalric cultures at this point, like the Seljuks were. I mean, this idea of knighthood, of the idea of the mounted warrior that has to challenge his enemy, face to face, and it is typical of the culture of the steppes that pours eventually into this dramatically chivalric and feudal culture of Persia, and that it's even exposed to those Western feudal traditions in the West during the Crusades. So Kushro wants to demonstrate that he can, as the Sultan of Rome, to kill by his own hand the Roman Emperor. Now, this is quite of a big deal. It says encouraged by his own physical superiority. You can feel this sense of, I want to prove I'm the best as an individual so that I can be an even more powerful ruler. And it's objective. If Theodore had died in that occasion, it would have been an amazing result. So never think that this is a matter of, this was just an idiot. We don't know. This is just a story at the end of the day. Surely we see that things would go seriously wrong for him, but it's still functional. I mean, it's still plausible that such things would happen on the battlefield in those times. It's still to be functional to that type of fight, right? But you need this, and it's possible though that this resistance of Theodore's elite would still be, somewhat functional to reverse the tides, right? Because here the author doesn't talk about this, but probably the battle was somewhat complicated. It's possible that the Turks had harassed the enemy. We've seen that the Byzantines began the battle, but it's possible that they had maybe harassed them back and forth with their tactics of horse archers, etc. And during the day, troops get tired, right? And therefore, even this last resistance of the elite that has the Byzantine elite that has remained in reserve, it's a fresh new shock force that can seriously do a lot of damage to the tired Seljuk forces, right? And it's interesting, by the way, that the same Kushro at this point is committed to combat, right? Which was something was expected somehow. We've seen it even in the battle. I made a 3 hours video about the Battle of Meander with Alperslan. That, you know, this idea that the leader, the chieftain, in this Seljuk culture had to take his weapon and go into battle, right, like a martyr of the faith. That was a big deal. You couldn't simply say, well, okay, stay here with my arms crossed and see what's going on until the enemy's done. There was a sort of moral moral commitment to these affairs that, however, can reflect an actual need at this point for the very elite of the same sultan to commit itself to the fight, right? So maybe, the Seljuks were still in advance and were seriously close to win the battle, but not completely sure that the battle was won. This is important, and because what would be the elite committed for at one point, especially given that a battlefield, a medieval battlefield, is not like a basketball field. You need space in order to maneuver. We'll see that Gregoris in the second source even says that the Turks had problems to maneuver in this very narrow Meander valley that, by the way, they had already campaigned into, so that they even knew. But that's a big deal. If you commit the elite that is usually in reserve, you need an open ground. So either the enemy has, maybe the rest of Seljuk cavalry was pursuing the enemy, the Byzantines that had been routed, so even getting away from the battlefield, which happened, and therefore there was still instead this elite of Theodore that was fighting to the death in the middle of the field, and you needed to wipe them out in some way, and they had no heavier forces than the Sultan's guard at that point, because it's perfectly plausible, frankly. How many other heavy troops could you have fielded at that point? They cost a lot. Probably they didn't have them. Majority of them was kind of light troops. So these are all hypotheses, but they kind of make sense in strictly military logical terms, and they have to be try to imagine this field in some way, even if we know so few. And here says de immediat. Let me see. Yes. So basically, Theodore and Kushro immediately recognized each other. This is also important. It tells you that there was a sign of recognition, and these people probably knew each other. They knew how to identify themselves. So there was even this pride at this point to be actually recognized. The problem of not being recognized on the field is something that happens actually very late in time. It's only when firearms get enough precise to make you avoid wearing flamboyant caps and uniforms, etc., that you need camouflage and stuff like that. It's even for regular troops in open field, right? At this point in medieval times, it was definitely a necessity sometimes that could even save your life to be recognized, because obviously you would have the enemy attacking you like crazy, but aside from the fact they would prefer to capture you rather than to kill you, but that you were still, especially for noblemen, being recognized on the field was sometimes, they wouldn't be butchered. Of course, their equipment was evidently more expensive than the others, so it was easier to recognize who you could make prisoner to ransom rather than to butcher like a simple peasant. But this idea of even giving pride to the people who were around you, that they could recognize you, like I'm fighting next to the freaking Roman emperor, so and give you the confidence and courage. So this culture also of the duel, the challenge at single combat is quite a big deal, and it can be a literary topos, because you can't imagine what these battles, how messy they could be. But at the same time, it kind of makes sense that such clash can happen. It was really normal. During these medieval battles, it was normal even for certain elite troops to attack, to go after the enemy commander's bodyguard, elite troops. It happened all the time. As far as we're concerned, also the Italian mercenaries might have been used like that, like cut through the enemy lines and just butcher the elite and the Sultan down if you can. It might have been possible, right? These are things that were done. So here begins the duel, basically, between Theodore and Kushro, and the author says that the Sultan hit with his mace, and the Emperor, dozed by the blow he had received on his head, helmet fell from his horse. Helmet fell from his horse. So this is another very fascinating touch. I mean, the fact that military leaders used maces preferably. This was a great symbol. In Seljuk warfare, we said it also about Alparslan and Manzikert. It was something typical from the steppes, especially. It's the idea that the mace is a weapon, is a noble weapon, because first of all, it has this blunt effect that you have to use against armor. So attacking armored troops. So what does this mean? You attack the nobility, and maces are short weapons. So if you can get closer to someone who's heavily armored, well, chances are that you are heavily armored as well. There was some kind of bravado attached even in steppe tradition to even as unarmored troops to prove their courage, especially these young noblemen, etc., without any armor, as it was normal for the majority of Seljuk warriors aside from the elite to grab like the enemy's horse's tail. That was like the terrible insult that could happen on the battlefield. So in fact the Seljuks would usually knot their horse's tail, not to, because the whole fight was very physical, right? This idea of that the symbol of command is something you find even with William the Conqueror in the Bayeux Tapestry, or this idea that the mace is a weapon of command is something extremely old, right? Training with club is one of the most ancient military training ever. There is all a symbolism attached to this. Even the idea of medieval Christian bishops that fought with the mace because they couldn't shed blood allegedly. It seems that it's been a bit too overly emphasized as a concept. It's more about the fact that that was a bishop, so a very important individual in the first place, and rather than the thing that they couldn't shed blood with a sword. Also because we know that bishops used sword as well, largely. So it's more than a side weapon. It's it's the ultima ratio, regum in this case, we can't even say, because these guys, like the Sultan, wouldn't go to battle just equipped with a mace. The mace is a side weapon. You go with a lance in battle, but the lance breaks. Even the sword can break, right? So when you get to the mace, you're getting to the end of the fight, because your other weapon is broken. Of course, like this heavy cavalrymen had kind of their own squires, even from the Muslim side. It would change horse and lances, etc. But when you get to the mace, it's really because you go straight against that guy, not in a concerted cavalry charge, but you go, in fact, 1 versus 1. This is very important. It's a very symbolical information we get here. But that was quite real, right? It didn't stop to the symbolism. It was actually happening. In fact, Theodore receives the Sultan's mace on his head, right? And he was dosed by it. And hell yeah, that's, even if you have a helmet with the which is pretty resistant, with gambeson underneath, probably mail, etc., still you can lose your conscience, as it seems to have been the case in this sense. So get this blow on the head, full center, on the head of the Roman emperor, and Theodore, in fact, even falls from his own horse. And it's even said here that the horse fell over him. It was something pretty dangerous, because aside from the fact that horses are pretty damn heavy, they can even break your leg, etc., you can remain stuck under them. And hell, many knights died in that way, because they couldn't move under the horse's weight. But it's interesting because the source says it is said. So here it introduces, unlike other information I don't know. In fact, he states, although I'm not positive as to whether the Sultan hit it for the second time. So it's said that technically the Sultan at that point, especially if Theodore had fallen to the ground and he had loosened conscience, how could he hit him for a second time? So it's obvious here there's not a strictly logical connection. He's talking about things that were told, that are being heard. Remember, this thing was the official version of the battle from Nicene historiography, right? So obviously people at the court and things that had participated to the battle told a lot of stories about that. So he makes room for other versions. Also, not to say you're a fucking liar because he wasn't hit the second time. He leaves this option. These are important things. Never underestimate what the political problems could be, even in saying something apparently so small. And this is the Roman Emperor. This is not like the last of the soldiers, right? So it's important. And going on, the source says, but it was then that the unhorsed emperor was suddenly revived by some divine power, of course. Always remember that in medieval battles, it's not actually men that win battles. It's God that wins battle, always, right? And standing on his feet, Theodore unheeded his sword, and as the Sultan had turned for a moment to his soldiers crying boastfully, "Arrest him," the emperor struck a blow on the hind legs of the Sultan's mare, indeed colossal in size. Now this is fantastic, right? Theodore, just received a blow on his head. He barely, he wakes up, and while the Sultan is shouting to the other troops saying, "Arrest him," he basically strikes the hind legs of the Sultan's mare. It was enormous, right? Seljuks liked horses a lot, and obviously his mare was for fighting, heavy fighting, so it was big. And the interesting thing about this is also like maybe it's a bit too few to speculate, but the fact that the Sultan needs to turn and cry out loud to his soldiers to arrest him suggests simply that the Sultan might have gone very far at that point. Like he might have actually run into Byzantine lines without actually caring too much for his own safety, so he had to cry it from to his guys in the distance. Okay, just maybe 10 meters away or less, but it's still dangerous. In fact, we will see what happens there. And so his mare is struck, and the source says the Sultan fell as if from a tower. And think what it means to fall from a horse, right? Especially with all your armor on. It's not a pleasant experience. You don't necessarily have to fallen from a horse in your life, which is possible, of course. But even if you've fallen from a motorcycle, you do know what it feels like, right? So it's not pleasant. And dramatic thing. And all of a sudden, his head was chopped off. Damn, man! He beheaded the Seljuk Sultan. And it's what is interesting here is that the source says, although neither the emperor nor his attendants knew who had decapitated him. Now this tells you so much, right? The fact is because there are other sources. For example, that also in here, it's a rhetorical expedient to say nobody knows actually who decapitated him. Now, reality might have occurred in another way. Maybe Theodore and Kushro didn't actually meet. Someone else killed the guy and maybe even chopped his head off after he was dead, right? So we don't know. We don't know the times, we don't know the spaces, we don't know whether this is true. It's interesting, though, that an official historiographer that was writing under Theodore himself at that point, that had won the battle, was writing that nor the emperor nor his attendants knew who had decapitated him. Now imagine the situation, right? Now there is this emperor that's being blown down, and is at the head of the, at the feet of this of the sultan on horseback, and there are all his attendants were probably are around him because they're trying to defend him because they want him to die, which was normal because old Greek commanders were shielded physically by their own bodyguards in battle, and men always fight close, thickly compact, even just by instinct. You don't even need training for doing that. It's what literally every single human formation does instinctively. And a guy, and this guy falls from the horse and is decapitated, and nobody knows how and who did that. I mean, I can't imagine, the mess and all, but, this is normally kind of a close range. I mean, Theodore, if anything, was just right under the horse. This guy gets decapitated, nobody sees how. Aside from the fact that, the Sultan was probably very heavily armored, and it says all of the sudden his head was chopped off. Now, chopping off a human head is not really very easy. You have to get through a lot of stuff. If you're lucky, you can pass with your into soft tissues, even in between the I don't know how to say that in English, but technically your head can be cut off without cracking the bone, right? Because it can't pass between a bone and the other, the vertebrae, right? But come on, man. These guys wore things like aventails, and they usually had integral coat of mail, so the coifs and stuff like that. It's pretty difficult to decapitate someone all of a sudden. That nobody even sees that happen, right? And nobody knows who did that, right? All of a sudden, right? So it's pretty weird, but I can give you that in the mess of the battle, strange things may occur. Maybe who knows? Maybe Theodore didn't really want to kill the Sultan, but maybe to capture him, and instead another freaking angry soldier chopped his fucking head off, and nobody. Nobody wanted to attack that person because maybe it was another nobleman from the noble entourage. Who knows? I'm just speculating completely in here. And there is another source, which is Scutariotis, which says that, excuse me, that complements the Acropolis, actually, by adding that the Sultan head was attached on the sharp point of a spear, causing dread among the retreating Seljuks. And so it's important in here because actually it counters what I was hypothesizing now, that is that the guy could be, at that point the situation seemed desperate enough for the Byzantines to prefer to kill the Sultan rather than catching him prisoner, because at that point he was still alive. The Turks could keep fighting to take the Sultan back. So the fact he was killed and that his head is put on a stick and waved, like, look, we have beheaded your Sultan, right, and striking fear among the Turks, is something that apparently even had an impact. In fact, that's how the Turks basically lost, even though there are kind of doubts about how the battle's really gone, because as we've seen, the Byzantines also suffered terrible losses. So, it seems more like a draw. Like, it's plausible that the Byzantines won, since, the Seljuk Sultan died, but still it was probably a very, very, definitely a Pyrrhic victory. So aside from this, the source concludes by saying, thus the emperor, a loser until that time, finally carried the day, although he would not advance, that is, chase the enemy, since he had been with very few soldiers. Right, so this is very meaningful. Basically, here it says the Turks lost, and that the Byzantines, though they had suffered so many losses that they couldn't even chase the enemy, which means that they couldn't even have a minimal force of lightly equipped cavalry to pursue the fleeing enemy, right? And so this is interesting also because the Meander Valley is very long and narrow, so theoretically someone would flee, well, okay, maybe on the mountains, but it's kind of easier because they're bottled up, and you can butcher them down relatively easily. So this statement could hide maybe a much more serious situation, but it's generally assumed that it was a Byzantine victory, right? There is no sensible, idea to state otherwise. And then the thing says that this is why the Romans proposed a truce and the Muslims accepted and concluded a long-term peace with them, and so on. So this was Acropolis. And it's a very beautiful source. Now, let's read Nicephorus Gregoras, which has actually a very long and important text that, however, as we've seen before, has been written several decades later. And but there are complementary details that are very important. So, from Acropolis, we had a fair, logical story about how this battle developed. Right? Let's see what Gregoras tells us. So. And then Alexis III crossed the Aegean Sea and arrived in Attalia, in Asia Minor, where he met Yatatines, that is Kushro, the ruler of the Turkoi, so the Seljuks, who happened to be there at the time. He, Alexius, asked for protection and aid for his restoration on the throne of the Byzantine Empire. He reminded him, the Sultan, of the of their former friendship. We have seen that Alexis had hosted Kushro when he was exiliated from Iconium, and so on, and exposed and lamented in a tragical tone, with many tears, his recent misfortunes. And upon this he promised to Kushro piles of riches had he restored him. The barbarians accepted and gone into the barbarians are the Turks accepted and gone into the promises of money, although he had also received other plans, as he could have used the spoils taken from the Greeks in wars of conquest against foreign nations. So he gathered his forces and dispatched legates to the Emperor Theodore, threatening him with war unless he had his father-in-law Alexius restored on the Byzantine throne, now in Nicaea. The Emperor Theodore was at the beginning disturbed by the message, but he soon regained his confidence, put his faith in the will of the omnipotent God, and, deciding to accept the Seljuk challenge, dismissed the legates of the Sultan without giving them any answer. Then he began to gather his own troops, which were much inferior in number when compared to the bulk of the Persian, that is, Seljuk army, and had few chances of being successful against them. The interventions of divine providence, however, could make them seem superior and thus win. The barbarian, Kushro, arrived in Antioch on the river Meander, at the head of a big army consisting of both infantry and cavalry. He surrounded the town, thus beginning its siege. If he had succeeded in capturing it, he thought, the rest of the territories of the Roman Empire would have easily fallen in his arms. He had brought with him the ex-emperor Alexis III, who was serving as his tool for his devices. The Emperor Theodore thought that it would have been unwise to expect the barbarian attack first, while he himself would be wavering in his lance out of fear of a direct engagement. He was aware that if they had managed to conquer Antioch, thus getting hold of its spoils and using it as their base for their further campaigns, they would have been emboldened by their success. So he left Nicaea and marched at the highest possible speed at the head of no more than 2,000 cavalrymen, of whom, as they say, 800 were Latins, chosen men and renowned for their skills in warfare. After a 3 days' progress, they crossed the defiles of Mount Olympus, Uludağ in Turkish, which extends in a great length, serving as the borderline between Bithynia on the north of the two Phrygia on the south. He arrived in Phrygia after an 11 days' march and reached the place called Caestrum. He aimed at surprising with a sudden assault the barbarians, who would then be at a loss, not knowing whether an attack was really taking place or not. And so his sultan's resistance would seem like that of a toothless and clawless lion boldly attacking a pack, and unity had not long before been disrupted in many parts. Some of them, the Greeks, had been scattered in foreign lands, while others had been exterminated by the Latins. Thus the remaining few were so desperately lacking in numbers that they could hardly form a brigade, or a cohort, it says here. But despite that the Sultan had doubts whether he should attack directly the Christian army, it seemed that his former audacity and impetuosity had been reduced because of an ominous dream he had had. And truly, there is a factor that should be taken into consideration. In cases like this, when a small army are in a desperate situation, they can often overcome forces which may be superior in number, but are neglectful of their duties and in a state of callousness. So Kushro assembled his army totaling around 20,000 men. It consisted of archers, slingers, lancers, and swordmen for hand-to-hand contest. But he was expecting the emperor's forces to charge first, as he was particularly distressed by the fact that his cavalrymen would not be able to advance freely, due to the narrowness of the plain of the battle. That is why he was waiting instead of launching a direct attack on the Christians. It was the emperor's 800 Latins who began the battle by forming a dense formation and falling upon the central phalanx of the enemy. Showing a great deal of bravery and prowess, they slew many of them, thus breaking the Seljuk formations, and finally they reached as far as the rear of the enemy's troops. And then, turning back again, they caused considerable damage to them, as the enemy's slinger and archers could not be of much use for hand-to-hand battle. Moreover, the rest of the soldiers of the Emperor Theodore, without wasting any precious time, had marched on the enemy as well with tremendous determination. But as soon as the enemy came round from the surprise of the sudden attack of the Christians, they hit back the Latins by a mere shout and onslaught. They, the Latins, were quickly surrounded and exterminated. They, Seljuks, had decisively outnumbered them, thus suffering little loss this final engagement with the Latins. So after that the Seljuks turned against our troops, the Greeks. Part of their army were killed, and the rest began to retreat, and the leader of the Turkoi, the Sultan Yataniates, Kushro, had abandoned everything and was trying to discover the Emperor Theodore. When he located him, he immediately rushed upon him, having confidence in his physical prowess and superiority, and coming near him, Theodore, he struck a blow on his helmet with his mace. The emperor almost lost his senses and fell from his horse. God, however, did not want the emperor of the Romans to perish in such a manner, and his empire to come to an end. His grace helped him, the fallen Lascaris, to crawl away out of the ditch of slime where he had fallen, and made him stand firmly on his feet again. In this miraculous manner he was fit to carry on with the fight, although he seemed to have been defeated. So he moved rapidly towards the barbarian, the Sultan, unsitting his sword without difficulty struck a blow on the front legs of the barbarian's horse, and the mounted Sultan fell. Theodore then beheaded him before he could stand up. He then attacked the head on a lance's hedge and began to wave it, showing it to the barbaric troops. This was the main reason for the beginnings of the Roman victory, which had been effected through the mediation of divine providence, standing above any human power. The barbarians were filled with honor, and exasperation and started a massive retreat at headlong speed. The emperor had miraculously averted this imminent danger, and what is more, he eventually crushed the enemy. After the triumph, he staged a triumphant entrance in Antioch, where he offered his gratitude to the Almighty from the bottom of his heart. Following their defeat, the barbarians promptly sent a legation to the emperor entreating for peace, which they were granted. The emperor himself started its terms according to his own interests, so they were not favorable to them, the Seljuks. So here we go. Beautiful. You can see that it's a bit more embroidered, and probably there is a bit more of cliches in there, but it says something sometimes also deeper. Also here, militarily logical, and so let's take a look at it in detail. So also in here, let's skip at the beginning about Alexis III arriving in Antalya and the Kai Kushro accepting him, etc. But there is a detail that is interesting that Acropolis had not inserted, is that basically it's the first Seljuk legation to Nicaea. When the Sultan threatened Theodore with war, if we had not accepted his father-in-law Alexis restored on the Byzantine throne in Nicaea, right? And it's interesting, it gets psychological a bit. It says the emperor was at the beginning disturbed by the message, because obviously it said, damn, now they are attacking us because they're stronger than us. But he said he soon regained his confidence, obviously because he puts his faith in the will of the omnipotent God, right? So this is the model, it couldn't be otherwise. And he decided to accept the Seljuk challenge. He dismissed the legates of the Sultan without giving them any answer, which means is that, I don't even recognize you like a power, because I'm the Roman Emperor, you're nothing, and I don't even accept you. So who are you to threaten the universal emperor? And as we've seen, it's logical. It was not much of an option at that point. And therefore, Theodore begins to gather his troops that, here, this source says explicitly, were much inferior in number. Compared, however, to the bulk of the Persian, the Seljuk army, and they had a few chances of being successful against them, right? So here what it suggests is that these armies were, not even the Byzantine army was that small, and objectively 2,000 men or 3,000 men, as you see, it's not a few. It's not really a few. There can be some general discussion on, how many they were. Here I read what the, here I'm reading, actually going back once a second on Wikipedia, where it says how much do they put there. Well, but here basically Wikipedia it says, because usually Wikipedia in English is fairly balanced on this topics. It says 2,000 cavalry, 800 Latin cavalry, of which 800 Latin cavalry from the Byzantine side, and it says between 5,000 to 11,000 from the Seljuk side, right? Quoting actually Battle of Antioch on the Meander, 1211, Adam Ali, Conflict and Conquest in the Islamic World, Historical Encyclopedia, Volume 1. Edition Alexander Mika Beritz, 2011, pages 118, 119, which I haven't read, but it's a fair assessment. If, as we often say also in Schwerpunkt, it's rare to find actual battles where the numerical difference is this enormous, right? It's better. There's quality as well, and if things are balanced, given the general standards that we described before about what an average Byzantine force could be at this point, an average Seljuk force, it's plausible. But however, it's important that sources are, even the Seljuk ones actually agree on the fact that the Seljuks were way more than the Christians. So where were we here? Father-in-law, Sultan. Yeah, okay. So, of course, the intervention of divine providence, however, could make them seem superior and thus win. So here it says that basically God gives to these warriors the confidence to attack because, of their faith, fundamentally. So here, Kai Kushro arrives at Antioch, and here it offers interesting information on the composition of the Seljuk force. From a tactical point of view, it says that its Seljuk force consisted both of infantry and cavalry, which is kind of obvious because this is in order to besiege a city, you have to have infantry of some kind. I mean, you could use, of course, dismounted cavalrymen, but it's kind of a a loss of assets, meaning that you can't even bring peasantry just to surround the city and to dig ditches and something like that. While if you have horse archers, it's better if you use them for what they can do best, right? So, but it's interesting because this increases the plausibility of this force of having been substantially large, right? Let's remember that at this time, Seljuk forces included also troops of the local Byzantine communities that they had subdued, right? So these local militias of peasants it had been since the time of the conquest of Manzikert. Even in that video I made on the Byzantines and Franks in Seljuk armies, I explained this incidentally. So if you're interested, you can go there, and you realize by the 13th century, right, sometimes there were even more Westerners in Seljuk armies than the Muslims, right? And there were also naturally Muslims in Christian armies regularly. So here we don't have any information of it, but why not? The barbarian, okay. And he says even, he surrounded the town and besieged the city. And even also this source following Acropolis says if he had succeeded in capturing it, he thought the rest of the territories of the Roman Empire would have easily fallen in his arms, right? At least he thought. And this source even says that Alexis III Angelus was together with the Sultan. And here says the Emperor Theodore thought that it would have been unwise to expect a barbarian attack first, while he himself would be wavering in his lands out of fear of a direct engagement. So here he puts it on the honor thing, like saying, if he had not attacked the Sultan, he would have looked like a coward, right? So it was not, the proper thing to do. But as we have seen before, if this was a desperate attack, as the situation would suggest, this was the right occasion to attack the Turks as soon as possible, because this large force now had basically diluted, stretched during the siege, and therefore, and kind of probably the Turks, as we'll see now, hadn't even expected the Byzantines to attack them, to strike. So that was a clever move, but it had to be carried out with the direct intention of attacking the Seljuks, and therefore exploiting the surprise effect at its fullest. And here it adds even some interesting note. It says, if the Sultan had captured Antioch, he would have used the spoils and the same city as a base for further campaigns. Indeed, he could have easily dominated from there the whole Meander valley up to the Aegean Sea. So yeah, of course. So that's why this city was so important. And that would have been a serious threat for Nicaea. So Theodore leaves Nicaea and marches at the highest possible speed at the head of no more than 2,000 cavalrymen. Now this is interesting. Here we have basically a statement. It says that all the Byzantine army was mounted. This is particularly interesting. Now it's a bit doubtful. It's even possible that yeah, there might have even been 2,000 cavalrymen, but maybe there was some other infantry attached. After all, yeah, you can move with 2,000 cavalry relatively speedily, but you still need carriage wagons, other specialists, field aids, etc. So not everybody can literally go on horseback. So this thing that they were all cavalrymen, it's a bit, even if it was a fighting force, 2,000 cavalrymen, it's not a few in this time, but it's somewhat possible. I just kind of distrust it a little bit. But also this source says that of this 2,000 cavalry, 800 were Latins. So the Italians we've seen before. They were chosen men renowned for their skills in warfare. This is interesting because there is a continuous historiographical consensus in Nicaea here after decades that, these Latin mercenaries in the Byzantine army at the Battle of Antioch had been freaking cool, and kind of makes sense. Always remember that the Byzantines were, we started the video by stating that they had undergone a kind of a westernization in their military culture over time, which is absolutely true, but still, the heaviest cavalry charges, this is even what Anna Komnena said back in the day, the Westerners were the best at it, right? Because the Westerners were the ones who had fully developed feudalism, therefore they had best cavalry. This may be, it's obviously ridiculous to pretend that the Byzantines didn't have equally good cavalry, but let's say that having a less feudal society can have you less of those troops available. So of course, Byzantine cavalry had been also in early medieval times kind of the top cavalry ever. Even during the 10th century, we've made some videos about the Nicephorian cataphracts and all. The Byzantines had the best cavalry, even the best armored technology and all. But at this time in the 13th century, in a world that now, especially around Constantinople, had hegemonized by the Westerners, by the Franks, basically, this model had spread all around. So it was easier to have skilled, heavy cavalry available as mercenaries in here on a regular basis than having your own feudal force that also is usually also not excessively faithful. A lot of problems in Byzantine world had passed through this fact of this military aristocracy that also the Byzantines had developed, that had created problems with the centralization of the empire, had actually brought to a privatization of political and military culture, had created problems, right? So it's fascinating that the Latins were regarded as, the cool guys here, highly skilled in warfare and renowned, and chosen men, and all this stuff. It's important. It's important data. And the chronicle goes on and says, after a 3 days' progress, they crossed the defiles of Mount Olympus, this Uludag, which extends in a great length, serving as the borderline between Bithynia on the north and the two Phrygias on the south. Theodore arrived in Phrygia after 11 days march, reached the place called Caistrum. And through Google Maps, I just made a calculation, which is one of my favorite exercises, of calculating actually the speed and the itinerary as we may imagine them. And actually, there are two ways. The first one from Nicaea to the location of the battle. The first one is basically you get straight south, basically through Seljuk territory, to Seljuk held territory in a kind of a actually much tougher way. It's roughly 386 kilometers. So if this is an 11-day march, it's like 35 kilometers per day. If you take instead, it's not really a coastal direction, but it follows the Nicaean, territory on the west, you can get on kind of a smoother way However, for 483 kilometers, which means in 11 days you have to do 43 kilometers. Now, this is interesting because it actually tells us something that should be widely known. It's widely known to anyone who has ever calculated the speed of march of a medieval army on the basis of sources, that basically 30 kilometers per day is the average of any army that is marching with, at regular, speed, when you don't have to waste time, basically. So the myth for that, basically, medieval armies were slow, I don't know where people got them from, because objectively there is an incredibly macroscopical evidence that this is completely false. And when you study these speeds, and it's always around the same things, like 30 kilometers per day is kind of a standard. So this is very interesting, however, because in my opinion, keeping 43 kilometers per hour, if you have a mounted force, but still it's substantially large, you need carriages and so on, it's a lot. It's really a lot. So my take is that actually, I don't know, maybe other sources contradict me, but it's likely that the Nicene army actually marched straight south, so that they approached the battle location from the north, actually not coming from the Meander, from the west, rising up the Meander valley, but to the valley that basically arrives to the location of the battle here, that is Yamalak, right, from the northeast, because Yamalak is located basically at the end of the Meander valley, and at this head it joins in northwest with another valley, and that's where it could have been easy for these guys to have come from, actually from the same direction. So it's interesting because looking at this strategically on the map, it's not even just a threat to Nicaea from a land route here. It's really a threat also to the fact that the Sultan could seize now, relatively unopposed, a part of the, an access to the Aegean Sea. Right, he had already conquered Antalya, as we've seen. It was an important port that Byzantines had held for a long time, that preventing the attack from the Turks. So here, the maritime ambitions of the Sultanate of Rome are evident and logical. They completely make sense. And so let's go on, but let's keep in mind also this data that is, in my opinion, is very fascinating. It makes you understand much better what the whole thing was about. So this 11-day march, and probably surprises, in fact, the Sultan, especially if he arrived straight from the north, right? What are these guys doing? They take the worst road, and the most dangerous one at least, and in such a few time they can be here already in 10 days. And here there is all this consideration, in fact, that says exactly what the problem was about. He said that the Greeks, after the Byzantines, after the fall of Constantinople, had been scattered in foreign lands, while others had been exterminated by the Latins. So the remaining few were so desperately lacking in numbers that they could hardly find a cohort. So this still is used to introduce the fact that from one side, the Byzantines had to, were desperate at this point, because the Seljuk army was very consistent, so they had to find the best way to employ these troops, counting on other factors rather than number, that is speed and hence surprise, and attacking straight, with this 800 elite mercenaries of Western style warfare, and for this kind of surgical, direct, smashing attack, sudden attack. And also to actually stress the fact that the same Seljuks didn't deem the Nicaeans evenly possible to achieve what instead they did, right? The thing surprised the Sultan. He didn't want to believe that. We have seen it also before. He had to make the ambassador swear an oath to say, "Are you crazy? Is it possible that they're even doing this?" They did. So it's an actual accomplishment. Even the march, as we've studied, it before. It's quite amazing. That this is kind of a very interesting campaign, guys. I think it's beautiful, and you don't hear much about this battle, frankly. So here, Gregorius says, but despite that the Sultan had doubts whether he should attack directly the Christian army, it seems that his former audacity and impetuosity had been reduced because of an ominous dream he had had. So here, other thing that medieval literature talks about, sometimes often, is that commanders didn't want to attack because they were superstitious, fundamentally because they had had a bad dream, an ominous dream that had, foreseen, kind of a bad future, and in fact, this is what happened. So don't think that here it's the Byzantines were kind of criticizing much the Sultan, because they probably believed in that in some way. Even Coniates says something about that, about other, the same thing about, for example, the Battle of Myriokephalon with Manuel I Comnenus. And people did care about astrology at the time, for example, as well. So sometimes it sounds like a literary topos, but it might have been a series of circumstances for which this was a really obviously a dangerous situation in the first place. So you could be influenced if you're a superstitious person, and so at the point, or that others maybe would even think that you did that, well, actually you didn't, because you just feared it on your own for legitimate reasons, and therefore you were accused of having taken that decision because you had a dream, or you had the stars hadn't told you what to do. So that had told you not to do that. So it happens. And Gregorius goes on and says, as truly there is a factor that should be taken into consideration. In cases like this, when a small army are in a desperate condition, they can often overcome forces which may superior in number, but are neglectful of their duties and in a state of callousness. So here the author really centers the point. Here, in other words, the Nicaeans got the Schwerpunkt right. They understood what was the way to defeat the Seljuks, right? Here, they have a small army. They're in a desperate condition, but they can't acquire this confidence in themselves because of the fact that the enemies are essentially underestimating them. They're neglectful of their duties in a state of callousness, because at this point they are stretched around the city. They are set with that mindset. They don't expect the Christians to attack. And however, Kushro, that now has learned about the arrival of the Nicaean force, assembles his army totaling around 20,000 men. So that's a lot of people, right? As we've said before. It's not a wholly implausible number, like there might have been a 20,000 man army, but in this specific case, it's very unlikely. Very unlikely. What was quoted from that study, you can find also quoted on Wikipedia. It's fair. From 5 to 11,000 men kind of makes sense. We can't be sure. We're just guessing. Even an 11,000 men, it's a hell of a force at this point, and it's realistic. I would go for a kind of a higher number here. For the higher extreme. And here it adds, the source adds even other further information about the composition of the army. It says it consisted of archers, slingers, lancers, and swordmen for hand-to-hand contest. Now this is interesting because it doesn't specify. He had said before that were both infantry and cavalry, and we'll see says something more actually during the battle that makes us understand better. There were surely all of these type of troops, both mounted and dismounted, right? And we've seen that the Seljuk armies at this point were a mix between Seljuk traditional troops and Byzantine militias as well. So these armies that faced at Battle of Antioch weren't actually that massively different. Actually, they were pretty similar, right? And it's normal. War hybridates everything, so this is normal. And yeah, so this, okay, archers, slingers, lancers, and swordmen for hand-to-hand contests. It's quite a complete set of troopers that we can't assess, because here we don't have a dimension of how many, but we can guess that maybe, given the fact that he talks in the following passage about cavalry, that the majority of Seljuk forces in normal Turkish, in accordance with Turkish military traditions, were mounted archers, right? And in fact, he says, but the Sultan was expecting the emperor's, so Theodore's forces, to charge first, as he was particularly distressed by the fact that his cavalrymen would not be able to advance freely due to the narrowness of the plain of the battle. This is why he was waiting instead of launching a direct attack on the Christians. This is interesting. It may be a bit of an expedient from the side of the author to say that the Seljuks were kind of overly confident. So this matches with the 20,000 men, was possibly exaggerated number, because I think it would have not made sense for the Seljuks to attack these guys first. As we've seen in the first phase, it's the Byzantines that open battle. Surely it's possible that, when the Nicene army appeared, maybe these troops remained kind of a few time, looking at each other, maybe even one day, who knows. As we've seen, the Byzantines were running against time, fundamentally. So it's possible that they attacked, just the day after. It's rare that, especially after a 30 kilometers march, you can immediately fight. So at least one day of rest might have taken place, and surely during the night, as it was normal, there would be skirmishes, something like that, especially with the Turks that had those horse archers that were perfect for that. So, but it's possible. I mean, here the intention that the author claims that Kai Kushro had is not fully coherent. I mean, I'm not saying it's necessarily wrong, but kind of doesn't make sense, right? Let's wait for those guys to attack you in the first place. Why advancing first? Why feeling the need to do it, right? You might have been kind of surprised by the arrival of these enemies, but one reason more to be prudent. And what is more interesting here is that of the terrain considerations, like the fact that the Seljuk cavalry that the Sultan was particularly distressed by the fact that his cavalrymen would not be able to advance freely due to the narrowness of the plain of battle, right? So this is what allegedly would have not made the Sultan attack the Christians first. How to interpret this? Well, it's interesting because, first of all, we don't know where the battle was actually fought precisely. The place, I mean, the location, because maybe we know, but it's still an hypothesis. And the point is, they're not very open plains there. Like objectively, the valley gets narrow in there, basically even stops at one point. It's kind of a hilly area. So definitely it's not the best for cavalry. And so this is right? And all the more interesting considering the numbers. If this was really a sizable army from the Seljuk side, deploying all of the strength of these troops was more difficult, was more complicated. And we'll see now with the further development of the battle how this makes sense, also how the Byzantines fought. So also this source, following the previous one, states that it was the emperor's 800 Latins who began the battle, and specifies by forming a dense formation and falling upon the central phalanx of the enemy. So this is interesting. Regarding the formation, the dense formation, here I don't know in Greek what word he used. If it is kind of a syntagma, it's possible. It would mean that were the typical, it could be the kuneos, the wedge formation that normally knights used when charging. You find it extensively in any heavy cavalry engagement in Europe. So these were, as we've seen, heavy cavalrymen, fundamentally quite chosen troops, and they were trained definitely to stick together in a very thick, compact formation. And why not even with a wedge? Here it doesn't actually state that it's by dense formation. Here it talks about the formation order, if anything. But I want to suggest that this was more than that. It was even a conus, especially if the enemy is so large in numbers. You really want to break through, as we will see they will do. Well, the wedge formation is best. So it's point here. I think the term in Greek is literally the phalanx, the central phalanx of the enemy, which is interesting because we have seen, and as we will see now again, that there is infantry involved. I don't see here, but phalanx, however, and I found it extensively in many sources of medieval warfare, also in Greek, but I think also in the ancient world. Actually, phalanx it's not specific of infantry, right? Many people think, the phalanx is the thing like the Macedonian pikemen. No, phalanx is a much more loose-fitting term. It's usually used for heavily armored and thickly packed infantries, so that the ancient Greeks used this term to define, Celtic armies like phalanxes. It's literally the bulk of their troops. So I presume here that, the same source said that the Seljuks had infantry, and we may even think that the central phalanx was made up by infantrymen. It's possible, right? We've seen the Seljuks might have easily fielded militiamen that were essentially spearmen, troops like that. So why not? Central phalanx, maybe some wings that, as we'll see now, probably were there, because the hypothesis is legitimate, looking how, especially this account tells the story, it's probably it. It kind of makes sense. So it's possible that the Italian mercenaries charged into the central phalanx of infantry, that they defeat. In fact, here going on, it says, showing a great deal of the Latins showing a great deal of bravery and prowess, they slew many of them, thus breaking the Seljuk formations, and finally they reached as far as the rear of the enemy's troops. Now, this is very meaningful. Even before we said that there were often in medieval warfare this picked body of troops, they are called also in this by this source, that of heavily armored cavalrymen that attacked even the enemy leaders through the enemy ranks by literally piercing them through. Heavy cavalry in the 13th century was capable of doing that, especially if in front of them they had just a bunch of militia that, as we have seen here, got slaughtered by the charge, right? And here the source goes as far as saying that the Latin cavalry reached as far as the rear of the enemy's troops, which means that basically they pierced through the entire Seljuk formation. Is it possible? Yes, it is. Actually, it is. There is really nothing wrong, given that this is probably just a section of the Seljuk line, because the central phalanx of the enemy means essentially this. Probably this was not a very articulated formation. That they probably had a center, and maybe that was like the enemy, like the heavy Seljuk cavalry in the rear, and the wings of horse archers. It kind of sounds plausible, given especially how the battle will evolve now. So yeah, it's perfectly possible that that they went as far as that. And what is interesting is that there is an evolution in this maneuver, even within this Seljuk, within this space, because he says that the Latins then turned back again and caused considerable damage to the Turks, as their enemies' slinger and archers could not be of much use for hand-to-hand battle. Now this is freaking interesting, because it sounds like the charge of the Latin knights here disrupted the whole Seljuk formation. at the point that they pierce through it and they have time to come back to slaughter, the slingers and archers here says that they were not much of use into hand-to-hand battle. So here it doesn't specify whether it's infantry or not. Like the slinger has to be an infantryman. The archer in this sense can be. So it's possible that were foot slingers and archers together with horse archers, that however the latter of which were probably deployed on the flanks. So what the Latins do is that they massacre this center made up of infantry probably, and then they come back to butcher down slingers and archers that probably had dispersed, but before the Latin charge, and that were still out there. Maybe now that we're starting to knock out the same knights at a distance. The slings are pretty effective, especially against cavalry. Maybe hitting even their own. Think about the mass in here. But the whole point in here is that it sounds like the Latin charge has literally disrupted the entire Seljuk formation. How is this possible? Well, it is possible. It actually happened many times in Western versus Turkish warfare, that the Turks always kind of lacked heavy infantry in comparison to the Westerners. That was their weak point. Well, in fact, it was the lack of light infantry, light cavalry, that was the strong point of the Turks, is what the Westerners usually lacked. So here, basically, you have a center that had from the Seljuk of the Seljuk army. There's a very poor consistency, right? And what the Turks were mostly up to was flanking the enemy, skirmishing the enemy at a distance. So this center, probably militiamen, were wiped out because this infantry could not stand a heavy cavalry charge. Remember that at the time, excuse me, basically up to the Battle of Courtrai and the series of battles of the first half of the 14th century, infantry had never been able to defeat cavalry since basically the 11th century, sometimes the mid-12th century in certain areas, if not with the help of cavalry. That was really the decisive arm. So here, especially at the beginning of the 13th century, it was normal for cavalry to rule the field, especially the heavy feudal one of the Frankish of the West, let's say, like this one. So what happens in here gets even more interesting, right? However, it seems that there's a bit of difficulty from the Latin side, because always remember that cavalry is never as weak as rightly after the charge, right? That's the moment in which they are the weakest. So the fact that this heavy cavalry has to turn back again, as the Byzantines say, sounds like they're starting to freak out, because they have seen that they have broken the enemies, but probably they don't have the elan, the momentum now, to charge maybe what the rear of the Seljuk army was, that we don't know. Probably it was a heavy cavalry around the Sultan, as we've seen, but they probably start getting, at this point, targeted, in fact, by these missile troops, and they start suffering losses, because at this point they're in the very center of the enemy formation. They're taking hits from all sides, probably. So the fact that, and what makes it worse actually, is that a heavy cavalryman, which is functional basically to a straight cavalry charge and nothing else. At least, of course, they can't fight in any way, but the fact of chasing slingers and archers, it's a huge waste. It's a huge waste. You don't send slingers and you don't send heavy cavalry wasted by essentially spreading it to attack light infantry. They lose cohesion. They tire themselves down. These guys are freaking heavy. They have heavy armors, heavy horses. So this thing, even though the Byzantine narrative here tends to give a kind of a positive detail of it by saying, oh, well, they arrived up to the rear of the enemy, and then they come back and start slaughtering slingers and archers. However, is probably hiding a situation that was getting immediately way more messy by the sheer fact that the Seljuks were massively superior in numbers, as we've seen. So the Western cavalrymen, knew how to do one thing like no one else, at the level of no one else. That was charging straight and destroying literally everything they found themselves in the front. But these other maneuvers, they couldn't do that because they were too heavy. The same thing that allowed them to break so heavily through the enemy lines. It was also, at this point, its greatest weakness. And in here, that's pretty messy, especially if it is true, as the sources claims, that the Byzantines had 2,000 2,000 cavalry. I mean, this 1,200 Byzantine cavalry altogether. Well, that starts becoming, a pretty messed up battlefield in which even charging in one place has become difficult, because then you have in front of you, from the Byzantine perspective, those Latin cavalrymen fighting. You have probably Turks from all sides of them. You don't know where to charge. Also, because if you charge from one side, the Turks have lighter cavalry, they can't retreat, and you waste that momentum even on that flank, and the battlefield becomes too messy because you even charge with you have to charge either one side or the other. I mean, it starts becoming really, really complicated. So, the source goes on and says actually this, which is interesting. That moreover, the rest of the soldiers of the Emperor Theodore, without wasting any precious time, had marched on the enemy as well as the tremendous determination. So this is the thing. And now let's reflect on it, because the thing gets messed up, as I was saying. But here I said something different. I said that basically it would be difficult to... Basically, the Byzantines now were trying to follow up the Latin charge. So advancing, trying to wipe out the remains of the Seljuks by hoping that their advance would melt them away. Very risky, very risky. And in fact, here the mess happens. Because it says, but as soon as the enemy came round from the surprise of the sudden attack of the Christians, they hit back the Latins by a mere shout and onslaught. Right? So, there is this Seljuk counterattack that here, as I understood, came, but as soon as the enemy came round, surprises. Okay, we're quickly surrounded. Yeah, the onslaught. In fact, it says the Latins were quickly surrounded and exterminated. What does this mean? Well, it means that the Byzantines might have been advancing now, so trying to support a close range the Latins, but the situation is a bit difficult at this point. As I've said before, I have my perplexities, but especially the Seljuks come out. Maybe some of them had been concealed. This was normal also for Turkish tactics, that they were scattered around the mountains, for example, to attack all together. Since also the Seljuks, as we've seen, had difficulty maneuvering entire block of formation because of the narrowness of the valley. It's possible that they were scattered now all around, that they would attack all together from this maybe hiding points, and by choosing this moment in which the Latins were all scattered. Scattered. They were tired and so on. So here, it's important because after that even says the Seljuks turn against the Byzantines, right? So my take on this is that the author might have said that the Byzantines had advanced to support the Latins, and maybe they were advancing, but they had not reached them. Because here it's told in two stages. It says that the Seljuks, after they annihilate the Latins, they turn towards the Greeks, right? So it's important here. Basically, the Latins get probably overwhelmed from all sides. Probably the Seljuks basically attack simply from the flanks, and they massacre entirely the Latins. Let's reread this point. But as soon as the enemy came round from the sudden attack of the Christians, they hit back the Latins by a mere shout and onslaught. The Latins were quickly surrounded and exterminated. The Seljuks had decisively outnumbered them, thus suffering little loss in this final engagement with the Latins. So this is clear, right? So the Seljuks, tired the Latins down, they scattered them because they attacked them with skirmishers from every side, and then they attack all together with all their force, probably the wings that had remained unattacked, while probably it was still a reserve of heavier cavalry, probably the Sultan bodyguard, and they wiped them out. So that's very easy. While the heavy cavalryman is tired, it's very vulnerable. And what cavalry is, has lost the momentum now, cannot attack. And cavalry cannot defend by definition. So now they had instead the Turks attacking them, and they couldn't defend. So this is elementary military logic. So the Latins are overwhelmed. And this is something you can afford to do with horse archers that are not... Here we've seen that it was a difficult terrain, but horse archers in general also fight at little groups. We've seen it also in the Battle of Manzikert. It's not that there is an entire rank of horse archers that march together like a rank of heavy cavalrymen that have, say, all thickly packed together. Basically, everybody does something on their own. They can work together in groups of 10. They usually make this circle known as Cantabrian tactics, the Cantabrian circle, by basically shooting arrows in continuation, by running around so that the guy that arrives the closest to the enemy ranks shoots and then reloads when he turns around and shoots once again. But here it's more than that. Probably these horse archers are so many that attack the Latins even in hand-to-hand combat, because there are so many compared to them that they can easily overwhelm them. Right, and never underestimate the fear here, the morale. It's not that the Latins were fighting. The other source said they were. They didn't say they were fighting to the death. In fact, we also criticized that, meaning that probably Latins here didn't. Yeah, probably some of them fought to the death, but most of them were simply captured and killed. Right, because they had nowhere to flee from. Because it's like a human tide that submerges you. That's literally how it happens. So you can do that with these swarms of horse archers that you don't have to keep information, essentially. And you can use in that function, right? So at this point, the Byzantines, whether they had remained where they were or they were actually advancing, as this source says, they are attacked in turn by the Seljuks, right? Because it says, so after that the Seljuks turn against our troops, the Greeks, and part of the Byzantine army was killed and the rest began to retreat. So this is a pretty serious situation, because it's obvious that if the Byzantines were still advancing, that their formation is still intact, but probably at this point, I don't know by whom they are charged, because after this we immediately have the episode of Kushro that gets into battle. So we don't know whether the Byzantines had been attacked at this point by the horse archers as well, or by the Seljuk heavy cavalry. I opt for the second. I mean, it makes more sense in military logics to think, as it often happened in many other battles of medieval warfare, that these horse archers, while having finally annihilated the enemy, they ran away. They get usually or pillaging the enemy camp, or pursuing the enemy. Also because they're fundamentally looters, right? Don't think that these horse archers were guys like soldiers that were framed. No, these were like brigands. People were gathered there just for the sake of loot and fight. That's where Anatolia was full of after the Seljuk migration, and would remain like forever up to Ottoman times. So yeah, and at this point the situation seems hopeless for the Byzantines, because from the Byzantine sources, but probably still the battle was not really decided, right? Because both the Latins, probably the horse archers, are out of the equation. So it's basically this 1,200 Byzantine cavalry that is probably weaker than the Latins were, and and probably the elite of Seljuk forces. So this is like 1 versus 1, and this probably facilitates, I mean, it renders more plausible the clash between Kushro and Theodore, because at that point it's these 2 sections of the army that fight together while the others are somewhere else. This is important, very important. And it's possible that slingers and archers were hitting the Byzantines at the same time, so that, in fact, here it says that most of the Byzantines retreated. They fled. That it says part of their army were killed and the rest began to retreat. Even the other sources had stated that. So probably now the Turks were launching this combined arms tactics against the Christians by charging them with heavier cavalry and shooting at them with arrows and stones. And yet probably Byzantines here, I'm not entirely sure, honestly. It's possible that this was an entirely mounted unit as well. The Byzantines didn't quite have infantry, but at one point, when you're attacked, especially by overwhelming numbers of enemies, you can also dismount. We've seen that the Theodore was fell from his horse, so he was still on horseback, but this doesn't tell us actually whether his entire force at this point was still mounted. And probably if most of its troops had fled, chances are that most of those who were existing had dismounted to acquire more defensive capabilities, because, let's say, again, cavalry by definition cannot defend itself by attacking forces. They can do it, but they're very vulnerable and they have to dismount better. So remaining on horseback naturally was a matter of also pride, especially for the commander, and probably the odds were still kind of balanced for him to remain there. In that, if he had dismounted himself, it would have been quite of a problem. Let's say that these sources, by the way, do not tell what the Byzantines thought when Theodore fell from the horse. Like Kushro gets killed seemingly right afterwards. But even seeing your commander falling, as it happened for the same Turks, in fact, here, it was a terrifying event. So this was really a messed up situation. It was really the climatic part of the battle. And the source says, and the leader of the Turkoi, the Sultan Yetaniates, that is Kushro, had abandoned everything and was trying to discover the Emperor Theodore. Now this is interesting because it's, we've seen that here at the Turkoi, the barbarians, the Persians. So this guy had abandoned everything, was trying to discover the Emperor Theodore. Like, he was like an animal chasing for his prey, devoured by this sense of, irrationality that wants to be portrayed here. Probably wasn't like this, but definitely the pride of taking Theodore as prisoner, killing him, was enormous, as we've seen. It was kind of a sensible thing to do. When he located him, he immediately rushed upon him, having confidence in his physical prowess and superiority, and coming near him, that is near Theodore, he struck a blow on his head, that is his helmet, with his mace, as we have seen in Acropolis. The emperor almost lost his senses and fell from his horse. God, however, did not want the emperor of the Romans to perish in such a manner, and his empire to come an end. His grace helped him, the fallen Lascaris, to crawl away out of the ditch of slime where he had fallen, and made him stand firmly on his feet again. Right? So this is very interesting, because it adds the it's the same story. He gets hit in the head by the mace of the Sultan, and he falls from the horse, losing his senses. And here there is the extra detail that he fell into a ditch of slime, which is interesting because, as we said before, these battlefields are not basketball fields. That you find everything in the middle, like ditches, farms, bushes, etc. Even the river. We don't know where the battle was fought, for example, compared to the river here. And it's possible that the ditch in here was maybe a line of defense that the Byzantines had chosen for their own cavalry. That could be easily done. You know, that you send the heavy troop forward, but you still deploy your second line behind a ditch, which is a kind of a sensible thing to do, considering that you know, the enemy is overwhelmingly superior. So you're not going to lose the opportunity to gain a little bit of a terrain advantage by deploying behind a field. This is normally what weaker armies do, especially the ones that, you know, if you, excuse me, if you feel, yeah, you know, you understand what it means. So, so he falls into the ditch, which is interesting because this is also a literary expedient to say, look at how low the Roman Emperor had fallen, like into the ditch of slime. Blah. You know, this is the Roman Emperor, guys. This is Christian Roman Emperor, universal ruler of the world. You know, he falls into a ditch of slime. It tells you how risky, how close to death and to the below he had come to, right? But it's God who takes him out. So it's a sort of redemption, or catharsis, let's say, a resurrection. It says, in this miraculous manner, he was fit to carry on the fight, although he seemed to have been defeated. Beautiful, right? So this is a miracle. And this could conceal maybe the fact that maybe the Byzantines had freaked out at that point. Here it doesn't fit with the narrative, because as we've seen also before, you know, the Byzantines first are a bit upset, including Theodore, about the fact that the Seljuks had invaded their own land. But, you know, they think through their fate, they find the courage to go fight. So at this point, it didn't sound that well. The Byzantines losing faith once, losing morale once again, not believing. But losing faith proper, because at that point you have to believe in God fully, right? If you're a true Christian. And so it's very interesting, and you can see that probably through this elements, you can spot the fact that probably these elements were true, right? There were things that had maybe happened for real, but that if you need to conceal, maybe you're doing it on a base that was in fact real. So this might not be just a topos, right? But it's possible. So, the source says that Theodore moved rapidly towards the barbarian, that is the Sultan, and unseated his sword. Without difficulty, he struck a blow on the front legs of the barbarian's horse, and mounted Sultan fell. Now, this is interesting. Also, this fact of the sword, you know, what was he fighting for? You know, if he had still pulled it out before, was he fighting with a mace as well? Or was it just, you know, fell from the horse, you know, he still had the lance? Who knows? It's a bit of incoherent maybe, or maybe he had just taken out a secondary weapon like a dagger, and without difficulty, important because he was an able fighter, this is the meaning of the thing, he struck a blow on the front legs of the barbarian horse, and mounted Sultan fell, right? So the front legs, the previous source had talked about the hind legs. Naturally, it sounds a bit more courageous and loyal to attack a knight frontally than from the rear, but the result is the same. The mounted Sultan fell. So at this point he says, Theodore then beheaded him before he could stand up. Right, so this is a bit less reliable. This is really more embroidered than the other source that claims that nobody knows, not even the emperor that has commissioned me the work knows who actually beheaded the Sultan. Here it says that it was Theodore himself, so we can be fairly sure that this is made up. It's interesting, he said he beheaded him before he could stand up. These things happen, telling the truth. You know, there are other, you know, battles I can think of where, you know, knights who fell from their horses were beheaded kind of the spot. You know, as we have seen before, it's a bit mechanically difficult, especially if you have all your armor on, to chop one's head off, right? So it's a bit probably an exaggeration, but still, at the end, the Sultan gets beheaded. And then the source says Theodore attached the head on a lance's edge and began to wave it, showing it to the barbaric troops. Right, so it's very powerful. Like I've decapitated your commander. I'm the better man here, and I did it myself. So this is the sense of the source. This is the sense of the action. And probably happened actually. I mean, we've seen that the Sultan was beheaded. Kind of made sense, especially considering what the Roman perspective here was. Like the Sultan would challenge the emperor and got beheaded. Like still a noble person, because beheading is not crucifixion, for example. But it's still, you're done with it. That's capital death by excellence, and that's reserved to Wu rebels, right? And Wu raises his head, in fact, against the Roman emperor. It's a very powerful message. And yes, and here it says this was the main reason for the beginnings of the Roman victory, which had been effected through the mediation of divine providence, standing above any human power. It's interesting. It says this is the main reason for the beginnings of the Roman victory. So this passage sounds a little bit like, probably something else happened, but we don't really tell it. There is no need for telling him. What do you want to tell him? Here was a Roman victory. The Sultan of Iconium got beheaded. That's the thing, by the same Roman emperor. That's the thing that matters, not other tactical dynamics. Who cares about that? That's the meaning, the symbol. You have to think what this thing was read. Everybody would have said, well, wow, yeah, we did it. The main point was the fact it was the Romans against the Turks, right? It was the point of the story. The Sultan got beheaded. That's the big thing. And divine providence made it, standing above any human power. Always remember it. Always remember it. Medieval battles are not won by man. They're won by God. Always. 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 There's no other way. This is medieval literature. That's how it works. And then it says the barbarians were filled with horror and exasperation and started a massive retreat at headlong speed. The emperor had miraculously averted this imminent danger, and what is more, he had eventually crushed the enemy. Right? So this massive retreat at headlong speed suggests many of the Turks were mounted, probably. We have seen that Byzantine, from the other source here, it doesn't say it, but the other source said that the Byzantine army had bled out so badly that they didn't even have the forces to pursue the enemy, which is also very dangerous, because technically at that point they can't even reform during the night and make something, it's a problem, But usually these battles, especially those who ended at dawn, at sunset, they didn't leave you much of an understanding of what had happened. Theoretically, as much as you knew that, the part of the enemy army could still be there. So sometimes it was not up to the following day that the actual victory was realized. For example, the Battle of Manzikert, it's not, the battle was finished by the darkness, and until the day after, not even the Turks had realized to have won. Remember this. These are important things. So this was a hell of a bloody battle. But it's interesting here, massive retreat. And it said after the triumph, Theodore staged a triumphant entry in Antioch, where he offered his gratitude to the Almighty from the bottom of his heart. Following their defeat, the barbarians promptly sent a legation to the emperor, entreating for peace, which they were granted. The emperor himself started its terms according to his own interest, so they were not favorable to them, that is, the Seljuks. And and this is true, because the aftermath, even if the Byzantine army had almost nearly destroyed, basically, the Khosrow's son and successor, Caucasus I, concluded a truce with Nicaea on June 14, 1211, and the border between the two states would remain virtually unchallenged until the 60s of the 13th century. And the former Emperor Alexis Laskaris' father-in-law was also captured during the battle. Laskaris treated him well, but stripped him from his imperial insignia and consigned him to the monastery of Ykeintos, in Nicaea, where he ended his days. This is very important. And following the battle, the Turks carried the body of the Sultan back to Konya, where he was buried in the dynastic mausoleum. Now, this is interesting because, if it is true, it means that, the Byzantines had beheaded the Sultan, but the Turks had somehow had been able to got the body back, or maybe the Byzantines did, who knows. They didn't get, I don't know whether also they had, but I don't think so. I don't know about they had, frankly. And this battle, it was a big, victory for Nicaea, the Seljuk, from Seljuk pressure, but the heaviest, the bulk of his forces, the Latin mercenary cavalry, had been almost destroyed, and the rest of the army also had suffered heavy casualties. So, as a consequence, in the same year, actually in October, Laskaris could not adequately defend Nicaean territory from the attack of the Latin Empire of Constantinople. In fact, he was defeated at the Battle of Rindacus by the Latin forces, and he had to cede some territories to the sea, bordering the Sea of Marmara. Right. The Nicaeans were compensated for this territorial loss only in the year after the death of David Komnenos allowed their annexation of his lands in Paphlagonia, right? And so the victory at Antioch and the Meander, gave Laskaris considerable prestige, and the capture of Alexis ended internal opposition to his rule. And this was actually the last major encounter between the Seljuks and the Byzantines, right? The Seljuks had failed to take all of Asia Minor at this point. The Nicaean Empire would strengthen over time, while the Seljuks would weaken, and eventually the Ottoman leadership would ultimately conquer Byzantine Asia Minor a little over than 100 years later. So this is a very fascinating battle, about which we know relatively few, as you understood, but that we can talk a lot about. And I don't know what to add. We have seen essentially a bit of a method of how to interpret sources and how to reconstruct a battle. Always make this exercise because it's dramatically useful and you can learn a lot from that. And that's how you learn how to interpret battles, because the more you make this exercise and the more you know how to learn about others. But you have to be thorough. You have to read sources. You have to be complete. Today we didn't read the Seljuk sources, for example. But that's also a problem of language, of translation, and also you should know, not really just reading a translation, but reading a translation has always a lot of problems because you don't have to translators. You should be able to know it yourself. But sometimes you don't even know much about the background of these worlds. So that's even worse, arguably, because you don't really understand maybe some extremely meaningful aspects of these stories that are needed to frame them better. So in any case, I was happy to talk about this today. I enjoyed it, and we will keep talking about this stuff in the future. For now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.